He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. These words could have been written specifically for the subject of our story, David Livingstone. Surely if there's one name that conjures up the boyhood spirit of adventure, the sense of mystery, danger and discovery that goes with exploring unknown territory, it must be that of David Livingstone. One popular dictionary entry on Livingstone reads thus: Livingstone, David, 1813 to 1873, Scottish missionary and African explorer. He discovered the Zambezi River in 1851 and Victoria Falls 1855. Henry M. Stanley found him in Tanzania in 1871, and together they attempted to find the source of the Nile. But that tells only a small part of the great man's story. David Livingstone, the boy from Blantyre, whose devotion to the needs of his fellow man has inspired many followers, deserves a place in history on at least 3 counts: as an explorer, as a missionary doctor, and as an opponent of slavery. In a lifetime spent in Africa, he traversed the country many times, crossing desert and swamp, fording river and stream, risking disease and death, and all in the interest of furthering man's knowledge of the dark continent, and of bringing the light of the gospel to its native people. And it was for the people of Africa that David Livingstone had the greatest affection. As a young man, David Livingstone heard the call of God to service in a foreign land. He planned to go to China, but the Opium Wars prevented that. So instead, almost on the rebound, and because it was an open country, he went to Africa. It is said of Livingstone that he only ever had one convert to Christianity, and that even he lapsed. But what Livingstone did was to inspire others, to show them the way, to prove that one man, dedicated to a purpose that is right, could make a difference. David Livingstone made that difference. What a loss to China. What a gain for Africa.
David Livingstone's ancestors were crofters on the island of Ulva, that's out in the Hebrides. And you know, they lived through one of the most turbulent times in Scottish history. 2 of his forebears actually fought at Culloden on the Jacobite side. They fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie. And it's strange that at that time people had to make up their minds. Were they with the Jacobites or were they with the Hanoverians? And of course, the Hanoverians were pretty hard on the Scots who sided with the Jacobites. There were some terrible things happened at that time. However, David Livingstone's family seemed to have moved away from the idea of Catholicism to become a Protestant evangelical family, very strongly so. And yet, when Neil Livingstone, old Neil, that was David's grandfather, and his son Neil, when they all moved down here in about 1792, they came here because the Highland clearances were on then, you see, and they were being put off the crofts because some landowners believed that sheep were more valuable than people. So they came down here looking for work, and at that time the Industrial Revolution was moving into top gear, and people who could weave were being put into factories rather than having to be weaving at home, you see. And this place had been built by a little man called David Dale. He had built mills all over Scotland, down in Ayrshire at Catron, at Stanley in Perthshire, away up north at Spinningdale, and of course he built New Lanark along with his son-in-law Robert Owen. And he came here and he saw this wonderful bend here on the River Clyde, and he said, I can cut a waterway through here, a lathe, I can get water power, and I'll build myself a spinning mill and a weaving mill. And indeed he did. Now, if that little fat man, who incidentally was a wonderful Christian gentleman, if he had not come here, there would never have been a David Livingstone. The family lived in this little flat. The old grandfather and his wife had another flat, but Neil lived in here because one enchanted evening he caught the eye of Agnes Hunter, who lived in the tailor's house. In fact, she was the tailor's daughter. The tailor's house still stands down there, and David Hunter made the clothes for the workers in the mills. So when Neil saw Agnes, they became very friendly, and they ultimately married. And they lived in this little room we are in now. 7 of them ultimately. There was Neil and Agnes, there was John, David, Janet, the daughter Agnes, and Charles. So 7 of them lived in here. I suppose in a way it was quite handy, because almost you could fry sausages and wash your face without getting out of bed. Think of them. Now, they didn't think that these conditions were bad. They didn't, because they had nothing to compare them with. At that time in the city of Glasgow, conditions for working people were appalling.
The young David Livingstone probably had no sense of deprivation or poverty. His family had a roof over its head, his father was in steady employment, there was always food on the table, and unlike the city dwellers in places like Glasgow, right beside him was the great outdoors, a ready-made landscape for his first adventures.
David Livingstone, very early on, began to show his adventurous spirit. As a wee laddie, he would cross the Clyde there and climb the walls of Bothwell Castle. And he was also prone to go down to the Clyde. In fact, there is one famous occasion when he went down there and poached a salmon out of the Clyde, breaking the rules. So he got this salmon and heard that the bailiff was coming, so his little brother Charles was with him, and he stuck the salmon down Charles's trousers. And when they came over the bridge, the neighbours saw this, and the wee boy limping, and they came to his mum, they came to Agnes, the mother, and said, "For goodness sake, there's something wrong with your Charlie. He's got a great big swollen leg." Livingstone later said it was just a piscatorial lump. Now, the adventurous spirit was moving in him, there's no doubt about that. At the same time, in his early years, he showed this incredibly big intellect. As a laddie, working at the age of 10 as a piecer, he was the boy who stood beside the spinning jenny, and as the threads were coming through from the raw cotton, if they broke, it was his job to tie the threads together again. Now, while he stood there as a boy of 10, and he worked from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, he would always have a book by him. He just could not be there without learning something. And this grew up in him, of course, until he finally went to Anderson College in Glasgow. He used to walk from Blantyre right to George Street in Glasgow to go to the Anderson College.
As has been said, David Livingstone came from a deeply religious and evangelical family. His father was a very devout individual, and nothing would have pleased him more than for David to be involved actively in the life of the church.
His father was a member of an independent church, which was like what the churches that came into the to the congregational churches now. Very devout, very evangelical, and nothing would please him more than that his son should become an active Christian. David thought he could do something to improve the lot through becoming a doctor. His father wasn't very keen on this. He thought doctors were people who were after making money, and that was they did their medicine on the way. But when he appreciated that he wanted to become a doctor so that he could really provide health and healing in countries where this was desperately needed, he agreed, and he went through a medical training.
Now, he went down to the London Missionary Society, and down there it was discovered early on that he was a pretty shy bloke, and this made it difficult for him to preach. Now, preaching had to be a very major part of a missionary's makeup, and for a time his lecturers thought, he's not going to make it. He just can't do it. But he overcame the problem of preaching. And then, as you know, he went off with Dr. Moffat to become a missionary. He sat looking out at this wonderful orchard at Cooraman. His great mentor, Dr. Robert Moffat, was a botanist, and he had created this Garden of Eden out there. Wonderful stuff. But David sat there and he said, well, it's beautiful, but I'm not here to watch the flowers grow or the apples to turn ripe. I want to go north into the unknown territories, to take my religion to the people of Africa. Now note this, when he went out there, he represented no denomination whatsoever. He says, I am a Christian, I bring my Christianity to the people of Africa. And while other denominations out there might have regarded the Africans as being of some lower order, Livingstone never did that.
David Livingstone was a visionary. He wanted to see the lives of Africans changed, but he knew he couldn't do it just by gathering groups of them together under the acacia trees and preaching to them. He knew there was more to it than that. He believed in preaching. He believed in the need for lives to be transformed spiritually, and he believed in the gospel's power to make that transformation. But he also believed that men and women needed material help. And that was at least part of his reason for exploring the country. It was to open it up, not just for missionary work, but for commerce too.
Later, Livingstone's work was seen to be mainly exploring. He was still a missionary because he really felt that by the opening of the country, which his journeys might help, you could bring in both Christianity and commerce. The commerce would be something that would help to end the slave trade, because there would be legitimate commerce and not trading in people. Now, Livingstone believed that proper commerce, along with Christianity, could go together and would be for the benefit of the African people.
I suppose we could say that most people nowadays think of David Livingstone as the explorer, the man who discovered the Victoria Falls, or rather, the man whom they think discovered the Victoria Falls.
He didn't discover them, of course. The African people knew they were there, and they took him to see them. But he travelled widely in Central and East Africa. He followed most of the Zambezi in its course. This was really starting to unravel the geographical problems of Africa. Before his day, of course, it was only really the coastal areas that were known. So by his travelling on the Zambezi River, he showed the interior Africa. Subsequently, of course, he became more and more interested in solving the problems of where the Nile came from and the Congo, particularly the Nile, because of course that was a famous river in history.
Livingstone never solved the mystery of the Nile source, but again, he had shown other explorers the way forward. They could continue where he had left off.
Again, within a few years of his death in this case, these geographical problems were solved. He had shown the way he'd started it off. And Cameron, who went out to find Livingstone's body, in fact went on to explore and show that the Lualaba was the Congo. And later, of course, the Nile sources were found. So he started off that his discoveries were the beginning of what led to the understanding of the geography of these rivers in Africa, the great rivers.
But it was principally as a missionary that David Livingstone went to Africa, and in that he was a pioneer. In those days, the local African tribes were to a certain extent itinerants, moving about the countryside as climate and the search for food dictated. Livingstone believed these people had to be reached with the message of Christ, and so he set up mission stations to cater for them.
He worked, when he went out to Africa first, for quite a number of years as a missionary, setting up small mission stations, which, because the tribes were moving and so on, they kept moving and whatnot. And it has been said he was very unsuccessful as a missionary. It has been said that there was only one convert which he made, and that was the chief Secheli, who he wouldn't admit to the church until he had put away all but one of his wives. And he became a Christian. Unfortunately, he then took back one of his wives for very good social reasons, and that put him out of the fellowship. And so it's been said that his only convert lapsed. In fact, that's not the end of the story, because Secheli remained a Christian, sometimes accepted by the churches, sometimes not, and he really, as a result, brought his people in Botswana, and the start of the Christian churches there was very much involved with him. So he was a success, really.
David Livingstone was a very devout man and always saw himself primarily as a Christian missionary. Indeed, in all his years in Africa, he never lost sight of the one true goal, and that was to point men and women to the only Saviour of sinners, the Lord Jesus Christ. He never saw many converts himself. Indeed, as we have heard, he only ever saw but one. But his pioneering work paved the way for the many other missionaries who followed him.
Again, it's said that perhaps he didn't succeed as a missionary. But within 2 years of his death, the Free Church in Scotland set off and started off a mission in Livingstonia on the west shore of Lake Nyasa, as they called it then, Lake Malawi as we know it now. 2 years after that or so, the established Presbyterian Church in Scotland set up a mission in Blantyre. The London Missionary Society started missionary work in the north of Zambia. The Brethren in the south of Zambia. The University's mission to Central Africa. All these mission societies, most of them will say that they started in response to Livingstone's activity and work. And if you ask the people in Africa, if you go to Zambia, as I have lived there and was there again 5 years ago, and they will say, well, Zambia is a Christian country. Now you may say, well, it doesn't look very Christian, there's terrible problems of corruption and these things. They say, oh no, we're a Christian country, and we owe it to Livingstone.
Nowadays, Africa is no longer the dark continent, unknown to civilization, mysterious and frightening and steeped in heathen customs like witchcraft and cannibalism. But in Livingstone's day, it was all of that, and yet he coped with it and even succeeded in breaking down some of the barriers of apprehension between Africans and Europeans.
Livingstone introduced African people to Europe. When he went out to Africa first, the African interior was thought of something who was fairly weird, perhaps a cannibal, had weird customs and all the rest of it. Now Livingstone was very interested in the social customs, the culture, the beliefs of the Africans he met. He was not unduly critical. He would accept some things which other missionaries would condemn out of hand, because he would realize there were cultural reasons and social reasons, and they had somewhat different. But he got on very well with Africans, there's no doubt about that, with the people he met. And in a way, in his writings and so on, he introduced the Africans to Europe as people who had their own society, their own thoughts and feelings and so on, which were not that different from anybody else's.
One of Livingstone's greatest aims was to bring an end to the slave trade. Slavery, that heartless, degrading, unchristian traffic in human misery, was promoted by both black and white people in power. The phrase, sold down the river, comes directly from the practice of African tribal chiefs selling their own people to the white man. Livingstone, who had gone to Africa to help improve the lives of his fellow human beings, was incensed by the slave trade and vigorously opposed it. The slave traders didn't like his interventions and on more than one occasion threatened him. But until the time of his death, he continued working to see slavery abolished.
It didn't happen in his lifetime, but within 5 weeks of his death, the treaty was signed with the Sultan of Zanzibar, and the slave market in Zanzibar closed. So he not only campaigned for that, but in fact the success came just after he died. Now that's a thing that is now past history perhaps, but it shows him as a great humanitarian.
You can't look at the life of David Livingstone without admiring the zeal and dedication with which he followed his calling. Jesus says, "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children, and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." David Livingstone appeared to live out that principle to the letter, to the extent, some would say, that his family suffered because of his zeal. At the same time, he was probably mindful also of another of Christ's admonitions to his disciples. "He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal." Shortly after he arrived in Africa, he had married Robert Moffat's daughter Mary. Even his approach to that transaction was unorthodox by modern standards.
If you read the letters that David Livingstone wrote about his idea of marrying Mary, you would say to yourself, is he going to marry a woman? Or is he buying a horse? He talks of her being a fine, healthy example and would suit him down to the ground, or words to that effect, would suit him fine. And he talks about her being a little dumpy person. But in spite of that, they really were madly in love with each other. She so much so that she dedicated herself to David Livingstone. And twice he took her across the Kalahari Desert when she was pregnant. All of the children, you see, were born in Africa. Now, I always think of David Livingstone that the last thing he would ever want to do would be to cause any hurt or discomfort or inconvenience to any person. But inevitably he did, because of his driving force. He could not help himself. He was a messenger of God, and he had to obey the instructions of his master.
There's no doubt that in all this, Livingstone's family did suffer, and perhaps all the more so because of the long separations that missionary life imposed.
Finally, in 1852, he sent the family back home to Scotland because he wanted his children to be educated in Scotland. And poor Mary, when you think of it, she had been born out there. She was born of Scots parentage, but she was an African. And she came back to Hamilton in the dead of a Scottish winter. And all of the children were sent back, none of them wanting to leave the warm climes that was their birthplace. And the most difficult one of all of the family who came home was young Robert, his oldest son. He just could not settle. And that poor boy caused all kinds of trouble in school. He ran away. And finally, Paraffin Young, Livingstone's great pal, who was looking after the family to some extent, arranged for the boy to be sent back to Africa. That boy did go back to Africa, but disappeared before he got back to his father, and ultimately turned up in Boston during the American Civil War and became a soldier in the 3rd New Hampshire Volunteers, and was captured near Virginia and died in a prisoner of war camp. Livingstone asked Mary to come back, and she did. She came back. She took young Oswald, one of the boys, back with her. And out there, she gave birth to Anna Mary, who was the grandmother of Dr. David Livingstone Wilson. And then she brought the 2 children back to Hamilton again. Then she returned to be with her husband when they were beginning the great Zambezi expedition. That poor soul, she suffered all of the ills that Africa could throw on her. And finally she died in 1862. And you know, that was a tremendous blow to Livingstone. And you know, it was 1865 before he discovered what had happened to his son. He never really recovered from that. Life was just bearable and no more for him. But he wouldn't give up.
At the very beginning, we quoted the now famous words of Henry Morton Stanley, who after months of searching tracked down the great missionary explorer to modern-day Tanzania. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" said Stanley when finally they met. What a meeting that must have been, and what a scoop for the young journalist. What a story for your grandchildren. But the story of that search for Livingstone began half a world away in New York.
Gordon Bennett, who owned the New York Herald, said, "Go out there and no matter what cost, do try and find Livingstone," because the world thought he'd been lost by this time. And of course, at that time, Livingstone, my goodness, he was a world figure. I say to the Americans who come here, you think Elvis Presley was a megastar? Not on a par with David Livingstone. He was world famous. And his charisma seemed to wrap itself around the world. And by sheer serendipity, Stanley found him, stayed with him for 4 months, and they travelled 700 miles together. And they got on like a house on fire, in spite of the fact that Livingstone never really believed that the North in the Civil War in America were really fighting to free the slaves. He said, "You are hypocrites, you're doing this for commerce, and you're only pretending to be fighting to free the slaves." And of course, that didn't go down well with the Americans of the North. However, when he met Stanley, he and Stanley got on very well together. You see, Stanley had been an orphan in Wales and had been sent out. His own name was Roland, and he had been sent out to America and was adopted by a man called Henry Morton Stanley. And he adopted the great man's name, his mentor's name. And They got on like a house on fire together. When Stanley met him, he was at a pretty low ebb. His health was not good at all. Stanley brought new supplies and more bearers. And when he finally left him, and he pleaded with him, he said to him, "Would you please come back with me? You're not well, even to the coast." And he said, "No, my mission is not yet complete." He wanted to find that source of the Nile. Now, finally, Stanley parted from him. But Livingstone said to him, "Do you know, I don't think the world at large will believe that you actually met me. So here is something to take with you to prove that we have met." Livingstone was very fond of red shirts, and he gave him a red shirt, which we have here in the Livingstone Centre, would you believe?
It was 1871, just 2 years before he died, when Stanley found Livingstone. The young lad from Blantyre was now a prematurely old man, weary and worn with his travels across the African landscape, and yet unwilling, even refusing to think of quitting.
He travelled on to the Chitambo's village at Ilala, which is right in the centre of Africa. And when he arrived there late in April 1873, he was in a dreadful state. And the chief there, Chief Chitambo at Ilala, said, "Let's build him a hut, a special little hut for him to rest in." And indeed, the Africans did that for him, and he lay in there. And he had two great African supporters, Chomi and Shuma. And on the night of April the 30th, or thereabouts, they bid him farewell, or rather bid him good night. They didn't know, but they were bidding him farewell, because he settled down and he said, "Would you give me a spoonful of calomel from a little bottle?" And they did that. Do you know that we've got that little bottle here? They gave him that. He kneeled down to pray. And then in the morning when they went back, they found him still in the praying position. They indeed had said goodbye to him. He had died. They took his heart from the body and the viscera, which was African practice, and that was buried in the ground at Chitambo's village, under the Mvula tree. And a relay of natives, Africans, carried Livingstone all the way from Chitambo's village, 1,500 miles to the coast. 10 of them died in that journey. But he was so revered that they had to carry this special man on the way to his homeland. And eventually, it took a year, the journey by land, and then, of course, the sea voyage. It took a whole year. But do you know what they had to do before they left Ilala? They had to break his legs and put him in a shorter casket, because some of the African tribes would not allow a dead body, a strange dead body, to be carried through their territory. That would be dreadful luck. And so they had to pretend that it wasn't.
By the time Livingstone's body was brought to England nearly a year later, it was fairly badly decomposed and almost impossible to identify. But there was one sure way of proving that these were the last remains of the great missionary explorer.
Early on in his career in Africa, he had been attacked by a lion, and his left arm was badly mauled. In fact, it never really recovered properly. Indeed, it had the appearance of having two elbows. It was terribly badly deformed. He never really had the full use of that arm again. And so the pathologists were able to look at this arm, and they knew that was definitely the arm of David Livingstone.
Perhaps it is most appropriate that David Livingstone was found dead on his knees at the side of his bed. Before him lay his Bible. The page was open at Matthew 28, where David had his life's verse, "Lo, I am with you always." These words were spoken by the Saviour But David Livingstone always maintained they were the words of a perfect gentleman. Our world has changed immensely from the days of the great explorer. There are very few geographical frontiers yet to be crossed. However, the principles of devotion to Jesus Christ, self-sacrifice for the cause of Christ, single-mindedness and stickability, these are enduring qualities. To all who would follow in the footsteps of the lad from Blantyre, they will still find today that the words, "Lo, I am with you always," are still the words of a perfect gentleman.
He died thinking that he had failed, that he didn't really achieve all that he set out to achieve. But he really wasn't aware of how much he did achieve. People say he didn't really convert any more than maybe one African chief, which is nonsense because he had such a personality, he had such charisma that he must have affected so many people who came into contact with him in Africa. And as a result of that, he is still revered. Africans come here, in fact people come from all over the world, but particularly the Africans, and they come in here almost as if they're paying homage to this man who brought the essence of real civilization and the promise of the Christian faith to the African continent.